Morning everybody, how you doing today? I wanted to tackle the topic of smartphones and personal profile information. Now we talked about that a lot last year on the show, but it's come up again with 3 articles in the last week that kind of went, hey, there's something else going on here, or at least it's time to revisit and to bring people back up to speed again. So those 3 articles, pretty straightforward. The first one was John Chen, the CEO of BlackBerry, talking about how he would instruct his engineering team to break the encryption on their products, if so asked by law enforcement. Now, on its surface, it's not that bad of a thing for a CEO to say, hey, if we get a legal request, we are going to follow through on that. In fact, that's what we want every CEO around the planet to say, because we want companies to follow the law. But the problem here is that by breaking a system, you're actually going to put absolutely everybody at risk, and it's a mismatch in risk management, in threat analysis. So when this has come up in the States, this has come up in Canada, this has come up in another number of areas, especially Australia, which actually passed legislation that permits this, which is that companies are saying we're building strong, secure products. Law enforcement is saying we're going dark because they're encrypted and we can't see them. But that's only one side of the story. The encryption actually protects us as users through millions and millions of transactions and interactions every day. Law enforcement has a very small portion here. Now, I've covered this debate a number of times. I'll put the link up here for some previous videos on this and some links in the description as well. I didn't want to dive into that, but what I did want to tackle was this was sort of one point that said, like, hey, smartphones are producing some data. Some of that data is encrypted and people are blind to see. Now, that's in stark contrast to another article that I read from Joseph Cox at Motherboard, who had a follow-up from a piece he did last year on data brokers and selling locations from your smartphone. Now, at the time, the US carriers had said, whoa, we're going to stop this practice. It's being abused. They haven't stopped this practice. Well, what is that practice, you're asking? Basically, what they do is not only to law enforcement, but to a number of partners, they sell real-time location data. Now, in the case of Joseph's investigative article, it's a really great headline. He basically said, I gave $300 to a bounty hunter to help them track down this phone. And what that was he had literally paid somebody in the bail industry who used their company's position to go to a third-party data broker. So T-Mobile had the original phone. It went to one data broker. It went to another data broker for the location information, and that third data broker was selling into the bail bonds industry at this point. But it was a highlight of the fact that there is a whole secondary and third tertiary market for real-time location data and a whole bunch of other data about your cell phone. So again, second thing that kind of popped up. And then the last thing was an article from The Verge that highlighted that the latest Samsungs have Facebook installed as bloatware that you can't remove. Turns out you can actually remove it. It takes a command line through a debugger. You don't have to root the phone, but the average user is never going to figure that out. For a developer, it's easy to do, but for the average user, for all intents and purposes, you can't remove Facebook from your phone. You can disable it, but you can't delete it. Now, there's a number of other apps that fall under the same category, but again, it was that last sort of like, hey, there's companies are saying they're going to break encryption, or at least one company, BlackBerry, said that they'll actively break encryption. Apple said flat out no. Google's never come out publicly one way or the other on Android. Then we see from Joseph Cox that there's this active market for real-time tracking data, and we know there's a whole bunch of other markets for data brokerage and profiling. And then Facebook, which is the worst culprit of all of them, is not removable for all intents and purposes on the latest set of Samsungs. These 3 together really highlight the fact that our smartphones, while wonderful, are generating a ridiculous amount of valuable information about us. We need to take control of that. We need some sort of awareness. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Personally, I think it is, but that I would leave up to each and every individual. What I really have a problem with is that people are making these agreements without understanding them. So it's an assumed trade-off as opposed to an explicit one. I've been in security long enough to know that everybody has their own initial feelings, they have their own position, they have their own use case. It's not for me to decide what's right or wrong, but what I do feel is fundamentally wrong is making those assumptions for other people. I like to see that an explicit trade-off when you're booting up your phone and it says, hey, by the way, if you give this location information, here's what you'll get, here's what you'll give up. That in an open and honest way. Now, there was another example that popped up this week on the home front in Canada around Bell Media, which is one of our big ISPs. They're doing a new opt-in targeted advertising profiling thing, and the way they've worded it is totally disingenuous. I'll put out a post, I think, on that probably this week or next week, because again, it's an example of how not to actually ask for consent and inform and educate your users. So some thoughts around that today. I think that'll bubble up to something else that might be actually the first episode of that new podcast I mentioned in the first vlog of this year. So that's a great large audience, sort of, hey, did you know your phone is doing this? Did you know there's a market for it? Might make a great story there. What do you think? Are you aware of all this data brokerage, the secondary and tertiary markets for real-time location? Let me know. Hit me up online at MarkNCA for those of you on the vlogs in the comments down below. As always, for podcast listeners and everybody else, by email, me at markn.ca. I hope you're set up for a fantastic day. Look forward to having this discussion with you about these issues, and this is going to keep going for the foreseeable future. But it's a great thing to be discussing out in the open. Have a good one. I will talk to you online, and I'll see you at the next show.